September 1st, 1939. The Baltic Sea was dead calm. So quiet, it felt wrong. A massive German battleship sat anchored in Polish waters, hiding behind a lie, a so-called friendly diplomatic visit. No warning, no declaration of war, no final ultimatum. Its four 280mm main guns fired out of nowhere. That single salvo didn't just break the morning silence. It lit the fuse for the deadliest war in human history. At the exact same moment, hundreds of kilometers away in Warsaw, air raid sirens screamed to life. The Polish people woke up to a nightmare. The German army wasn't just crossing one border point. They were flooding across the entire frontier, from East Prussia in the north to Silesia in the west to the Slovakian border in the south. Most people only know the punchline. Poland fell in weeks. They've heard the jokes, the propaganda, the lie that Polish soldiers were stupid enough to charge tanks with lances. But almost no one understands the real story. Poland wasn't defeated by backward weapons or cowardice. It was destroyed by betrayal, catastrophic strategic choices, and one brutal truth: it ran out of time. You've probably heard the line from the three-body problem. Weakness and ignorance are not barriers to survival. Arrogance is. That line was written for Poland in 1939. It wasn't a weak nation, not by a long shot, but it was a nation that had just put itself back on the map after World War I and made every possible enemy along the way. It picked fights with every neighbor, jumped in to help Germany carve up Czechoslovakia in 1938, and tried to play tough with both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union at the same time. It refused to ally with either side and put its entire life on a piece of paper. A security guarantee from Britain and France. Poland miscalculated two unforgivable things. It underestimated just how little honor its enemies had, and it overestimated just how much its so-called allies cared. But behind that fatal arrogance was a nation fighting like hell to buy the one thing it didn't have: time. To understand just how desperate Poland was, you have to look at its map. For a military planner, it's a nightmare. Poland is a flat, wide-open carpet stretched across the European plain. No mountains, no rivers, no natural barriers to stop an invading army. Even worse, its industrial heartland, Silesia, home to nearly all its coal mines and steel mills, sat right on the German border. The Second War started. Germany could reach out and crush Poland's industrial windpipe before it even took a breath. Eugeniusz Kwiatkowski, Poland's Minister of Economy and Deputy Prime Minister, saw this existential threat clear as day. His solution was one of the most ambitious industrial bets in European history: the Central Industrial Region, or COP for short. Kwiatkowski drew a huge triangle deep in Poland's rural, agricultural interior, naturally protected by the Vistula and San rivers. It was a safe distance from both the German border to the west and the Soviet border to the east. His plan: build an entirely new modern industrial heartland from scratch, purpose-built to fuel Poland's national defense. Here's how hard they went all in. Between 1936 and 1939, the Polish government poured more than half of its entire national budget into this project. They built a massive steel mill for specialized armor plating, a brand new power plant to run the whole region, and a complete connected military supply chain: artillery factories, aircraft engine plants, chemical works, and explosives facilities. This was one of the largest industrial investment projects in all of Europe at the time. Poland bet its entire future on the COP. And it worked. The factories here built technology that even shocked German intelligence. They made the 7TP tank, the world's first mass-produced tank with a diesel engine and a 360-degree periscope. Round for round, its armor and firepower outperformed Germany's main Panzer I and II tanks. They built the PZL-37 Łoś, or Elk, widely considered one of the most advanced twin-engine medium bombers on the planet, in 1939. And in top-secret workshops, they perfected a true marvel: the WZ-35 anti-tank rifle. This weapon could punch clean through the armor of any German tank from hundreds of meters away. It was guarded so tightly, it was shipped in crates labeled export surveillance equipment. Polish soldiers didn't even see it until the day the war started. But the COP had one fatal flaw. It needed time. Kwiatkowski's original plan called for the project to be fully finished by 1945. When Hitler's tanks crossed the border, the COP had barely finished its first phase. Most factories had just installed their equipment and hadn't even hit full production yet. Poland wasn't defeated because it was backward. It was slaughtered because its GDP was a tiny fraction of Germany's, and its brilliant blueprints couldn't be stamped into steel fast enough. Knowing it couldn't outbuild Germany's war machine, Poland staked its survival on its allies, Britain and France. They promised that the second Germany invaded, the full weight of the Western allies would crash down on Germany's western border. Poland bet its life on that promise, and in the final hours of peace, that reliance doomed them. On August 29th, 3 days before the invasion, Polish intelligence got undeniable proof. The German attack was hours away. The Polish High Command immediately ordered a full national mobilization. Farmers were to drop their scythes, factory workers their wrenches, and report to rail yards to draw their rifles. This was the nation's final, last-ditch safety net. But before the mobilization posters could even be pasted on Warsaw's walls, the British and French ambassadors stormed into the Polish Foreign Ministry. They gave a brutal ultimatum: cancel the mobilization right now. They claimed arming the public would provoke Hitler and destroy any last chance of a peaceful deal. Dependent on British and French loans to keep its military running, Poland caved. It pulled the mobilization order. It was a catastrophic, irreversible mistake. When the real mobilization was finally declared on September 1st, under a rain of bombs, it was already too late. Hundreds of thousands of young Polish men, who should have been dug into fortified trenches with loaded machine guns, were instead standing in civilian clothes on open train platforms, clutching bedrolls, waiting for transport to their units. And then the sky tore open. The ear-splitting mechanical shriek of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers became the soundtrack to Poland's murder. The Luftwaffe didn't target trenches first. They targeted the rail hubs, the logistical arteries of the country. They bombed the stations into twisted, burning wreckage. Trains loaded with ammunition, rations and reinforcements were vaporized on the tracks. Within 48 hours, the Luftwaffe had deliberately blown up Poland's entire telecommunications network. The fragile nervous system of the Polish command collapsed. The commander-in-chief picked up his phone, only to hear dead static. Division commanders were suddenly blind, forced to rely on horse-mounted couriers in an age of radio warfare. By the time a breathless rider reached the front lines, the positions he was ordered to hold had already been surrounded, overrun, or abandoned. The Polish army became a paralyzed giant. Its brain was still firing, but its limbs were numb and rotting. So where was the Polish Air Force? For 80 years, a Nazi propaganda lie has stuck to the history books that the entire Polish Air Force was wiped out on the ground in the first hours of the war. The truth is very different. Polish Air Force commanders weren't fools. They saw the Luftwaffe's strike coming and enacted a top-secret plan called Plan B. Days before the invasion, they moved every single combat-ready fighter and bomber from their big, obvious air bases and hid them in secret, unpaved field strips, camouflaged stretches of pasture, or dirt roads bordering dense forests. When the Luftwaffe bombed Warsaw and Krakow's major airfields on September 1st, they were blowing up obsolete trainer planes, hollow decoys, and scrap metal. The Polish Air Force survived the opening blow completely intact. They took to the skies that same day, shot down dozens of German planes, and delivered a brutal shock to the arrogant Luftwaffe pilots. But their survival only prolonged a mathematically impossible fight. It was a clash of generations. The backbone of the Polish fighter fleet was the PZL-37 In the early 1930s, its unique gull-wing design made it a world-class aircraft. But by 1939, it was hopelessly outdated. Polish pilots sat in open cockpits, with freezing wind whipping their faces at high altitude. Their landing gear was fixed, creating massive drag, and their only weapons were light machine guns. They were flying against the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the apex predator of the skies. The German fighters had fully enclosed canopies, retractable landing gear, sleek aerodynamic fuselages, and heavy autocannons. The Bf 109 was nearly 100 kilometers per hour faster. It was like racing an open-top vintage car against a modern Formula One machine. The Polish pilots could pull brilliant, tight turns, but the second the fight hit a straightaway, the Germans hit the throttle and vanished. To make it worse, the Luftwaffe deployed nearly 2,000 aircraft against Poland's operational fleet of fewer than 400. It was a 5-to-1 slaughter. Every time a Polish pilot took off, he was climbing into a sky swarming with half a dozen enemy fighters. Yet they fought with incredible ferocity. On the first day of the war, Polish ace Stanisław Skalski shot down a German reconnaissance plane, then single-handedly engaged a formation of 7 German bombers. But courage can't make aviation fuel or build new planes. Every Polish aircraft lost was gone forever. Every pilot killed was irreplaceable. Meanwhile, German factories pumped out fresh Bf 109s by the hour. Days later, their fuel tanks dry and their ammunition gone. The surviving Polish pilots were forced to flee across the border to Romania. They didn't die on the tarmac, they bled out in the sky. If the story of the Polish Air Force was twisted by propaganda, the story of the Polish cavalry was completely rewritten. The image of foolish Polish lancers charging blindly into German tank treads is the most enduring, malicious myth of the entire campaign. Erase that image from your mind. It's a complete fabrication. The Polish army kept large cavalry divisions not out of some romantic attachment to the 19th century, but out of cold, hard practicality. Poland simply couldn't afford to fully mechanize its entire army. Horses were cheap to maintain, didn't need imported gasoline, and could cross the muddy swamps and dense forests of eastern Poland where trucks sank to their axles. Polish cavalrymen weren't knights. They were highly mobile mounted infantry. Their doctrine was strict: use horses for rapid flanking moves through terrain no truck could handle. Find a concealed tree line, dismount, and set up heavy weapons, machine guns, mortars, and that devastating WADS 35 anti-tank rifle. The cavalry saber was a weapon of absolute last resort, used only to break the morale of unentrenched, unprepared infantry columns. They never, ever used it against tanks. Here's what actually happened on the evening of September 1st near the village of Krojanty. A Polish cavalry squadron used the dense forest to perfectly outflank a German infantry battalion, which was resting and cooking their evening rations. This was the exact scenario for a saber charge. The Polish horsemen erupted from the woods like ghosts, slicing through the panicked German infantry and inflicting heavy casualties. But as the Polish troops regrouped in the clearing, a reinforcement column of German armored vehicles suddenly emerged from the tree line, opening up with heavy machine gun fire. Caught in the open, the cavalry suffered devastating losses and were forced to retreat. The next day, German war correspondents arrived at the battlefield. They saw the dead Polish horses, the fallen lancers, and the idling German armor nearby. A brilliant, dark piece of propaganda was born. They manipulated the scene, filmed the carnage, and told the world that the primitive Poles had tried to hack through tank armor with swords. It was a lie that hid the tactical brilliance of the Polish troops and turned a bitter tragedy into a cruel joke for 80 years. By the second week of September, Poland's border defenses had disintegrated. The High Command was cut off from its units. In a desperate bid to save the nation's fighting strength, the Polish leadership made a brutal call, a full retreat to the Romanian bridgehead in the deep southeast of the country. The strategy was brutally pragmatic. The southeast was a nightmare of swamps, the Dniester River and the rugged Carpathian Mountains. This was terrain where the German Blitzkrieg would grind to a halt. If the Polish army could funnel its remaining divisions into this mountain pocket, with their backs to the neutral Romanian border, they could receive British and French supplies shipped through the Black Sea. They could dig into the rock and bleed the Germans through the winter. But an orderly retreat requires two things: a working command structure and control of the air. Poland had neither. The retreat routes turned into highways of unimaginable horror. The dirt roads were paralyzed by hundreds of thousands of terrified refugees, pushing handcarts and herding livestock. Mixed into this static sea of humanity were the shattered remnants of the Polish army. Artillery pieces pulled by exhausted horses, stranded supply trucks, and dismounted cavalry. And above them all, the Luftwaffe circled with total impunity. A German pilot later wrote in his diary, "We didn't even need to aim. The roads were a solid black mass of heads. You could drop a bomb anywhere and carve out a bloody empty crater in the crowd." Divisions were pulverized before they could retreat 10 miles. The army was completely fragmented in the refugee traffic. The Romanian bridgehead plan fell apart because the men needed to man the trenches were being slaughtered on the road. In their dying moments, Polish soldiers stared west, asking the same desperate question: where are the British? Where are the French? On the Western Front, the Allies were fighting what history would later call the Blitzkrieg, the Phoney War. The massive French army, with overwhelming numerical superiority over the thin German defenses in the west, cautiously pushed a few miles into the Saar forest. Their officers ordered them not to fire to avoid provoking the Germans. The soldiers spent their days picking wild blackberries and hanging hammocks in the trenches. The Royal Air Force finally flew over German airspace, only to drop hundreds of thousands of paper leaflets, politely asking the German public to abandon Nazism. Poland had paid everything for a life insurance policy, only to watch the underwriters walk away while the house burned down. As the government evacuated and the military command fractured, Poland's capital city of Warsaw refused to die quietly. The defense of the city wasn't led by a general, it was led by a civilian, Warsaw's mayor, Stefan Starzyński. When the panzers approached the city limits, Starzyński turned down a seat on the last flight out of Warsaw. He told the fleeing politicians, "You go, build a government in exile. Keep the flame of Poland alive, but if the mayor runs, who organizes the fire brigades? Who rations the water? Who tells the people not to be afraid?" Under his command, the civilian population weaponized their own city. Tram cars were derailed to form iron barricades. Women ripped their bedsheets into medical bandages. Boy Scouts, barely teenagers, crouched in second-story windows, clutching glass bottles filled with gasoline. When a nation's military hardware is exhausted, the raw, furious willpower of its people becomes its final asset. German General Erich Hübner, commanding the advancing panzer divisions, looked at Warsaw with total disregard. He dismissed it as an open city and assured Berlin his tanks would be parked in the town square by lunchtime. On September 8th, Hübner sent his armor thundering into the narrow streets of the capital. It was a massacre. Polish engineers had doused critical intersections with hundreds of gallons of industrial turpentine. As the panzers hit the slick pavement, their heavy treads spun uselessly, unable to climb the slight inclines of the avenues. As the iron beast stalled out, the Boy Scouts hurled their gasoline bombs onto the engine decks. The heat instantly cooked the crew inside, and as burning German tankers screamed and clawed their way out of the hatches, they were picked off one by snipers hidden in the rubble. Infantry assaults fared even worse. The Polish defenders had smashed holes through the interior walls of adjacent apartment blocks, creating a hidden underground transit network. German squads breaching a courtyard would suddenly face crossfire from a dozen windows at once. Hoepner's first assault was broken, costing him nearly half his armor. Humiliated, Hitler ordered the city erased from the map. The Luftwaffe launched the first indiscriminate terror bombing campaign of the war, a brutal escalation of the Guernica bombing. Hospitals, cathedrals, and residential blocks were pulverized into flaming dust. With no water, no electricity, and no medical supplies, citizens huddled in cellars, surviving on moldy biscuits. Through it all, Mayor Starzyński's voice crackled over the radio, a lifeline of defiance. When bombs destroyed the transmitter, the city fell into a suffocating, terrified silence until the engineers patched the lines, and the sound of his voice brought weeping citizens to their knees. Warsaw bled the Germans for 3 agonizing weeks. Only on September 28th, completely starved of ammunition and food, did the garrison finally surrender, to save the surviving civilian population from total annihilation. While Warsaw burned, another high-stakes thriller was unfolding in the shadows. The Polish central bank held the nation's most vital asset, 80 tons of solid gold bullion valued at $87 million in 1939. That was a staggering fortune, enough to buy thousands of fighter planes, enough to fund a government in exile for years. It was the seed capital for Poland's resurrection. If Hitler captured it, Poland would be erased forever. By September 4th, the bank's directors knew the gold had to get out. But the railways were destroyed, and the Luftwaffe owned the skies. Their solution was as desperate as it was brilliant. They commandeered Warsaw's entire municipal vehicle fleet. Bright red city buses, garbage trucks, fire engines, and police delivery vans were hastily rallied. Bank clerks frantically loaded the heavy wooden crates of bullion into the rusting chassis of public transport. They disguised the vehicles with mattresses, hay bales, and broken furniture to look like ordinary civilian refugee convoys. Commanded by Ignacy Matuszewski, a former Polish finance minister, the convoy slipped out of Warsaw under the cover of darkness on September 5th. Matuszewski gave his armed drivers a grim, non-negotiable order. We carry the lifeblood of the nation. If we meet Germans, we fight to the death. If a truck breaks down and can't be fixed, you bury the gold, memorize the coordinates, eat the map, and burn the truck. No exceptions. The journey was a descent into hell. The low-clearance city buses constantly sank axle-deep into the cratered, muddy roads, forcing banking executives to push them through the muck. By day, they drove the vehicles into dense pine forests, lying absolutely motionless on top of the gold crates, covered in mosquito bites as Stuka dive bombers hunted them from above. They drove exclusively at night, without headlights, navigating the suffocating refugee traffic, never knowing if the bridges ahead had been blown or if the towns were already swarming with SS troops. In a race against the closing pincers of the German army to the north and Slovakian forces to the south, the convoy miraculously threaded the needle. On the midnight of September 13th, battered, bullet-scarred, and caked in mud, the fleet of Warsaw city buses rumbled across the bridge over the Dniester River at Sniaton. When Romanian border guards intercepted the bizarre convoy, Matuszewski stepped out and presented his highest-level diplomatic clearance. When the guards realized the ruined buses were carrying the entire treasury of a dying nation, the Romanian commander snapped a crisp salute, tears in his eyes, and ordered the barricades lifted. The 80 tons of gold had escaped. Even with the capital surrounded, the Polish forces retreating eastward still clung to a faint, desperate hope. If they could just reach the eastern borders, if they could just hold the line until spring. History did not give Poland a spring. It delivered a freezing execution. Before dawn on September 17th, the heavily depleted Polish garrisons along the massive eastern frontier heard a deep, rhythmic rumble vibrating through the earth. A sentry peering through the morning mist felt a surge of euphoria. He thought the impossible had happened, that the British and French had somehow circumvented the continent and sent armored columns to save them. He strained his eyes to see the Union Jack or the French tricolour. As the massive steel hulls broke through the fog, there were no Western flags. Painted on the sides of the turrets was a stark blood-red star. Some Polish officers, utterly bewildered, actually ran toward the tanks with outstretched hands, believing the Soviet Union had entered the war to fight the Nazis. The illusion shattered instantly when the Soviet heavy guns leveled at them and a cold command echoed over the megaphones: "Drop your weapons, you are prisoners of war." Poland had believed its 1932 non-aggression pact with Moscow was a shield of international law. It failed to realize that in the dark forest of 1939 geopolitics, treaties were written by tyrants solely for the pleasure of tearing them up. The secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had sealed their fate weeks earlier. The Polish commander-in-chief, realizing his nation had been stabbed through the spine, issued his final, agonizing order: cease combat operations against the Soviets and flee across the Romanian border. The Polish army, as a cohesive fighting force, ceased to exist, but military occupation was not enough. Both Germany and the Soviet Union wanted the permanent, total erasure of the Polish nation. In the German-occupied West, Hitler's logic was brutal and industrial. The factories were seized, and the Polish people were reduced to subhuman slave labor. Hitler decreed that Poles needed no education beyond counting to 50, recognizing road signs, and understanding basic German commands. In the Soviet-occupied East, Stalin's methodology was surgical and terrifyingly precise. He knew that as long as the Polish intelligentsia breathed, the nation could rebuild itself. From the hundreds of thousands of captured Polish soldiers, the Soviet NKVD meticulously filtered out the reservist officers. Because Poland had universal conscription, these 22,000 men were not just career soldiers. They were the architects of Polish society, university professors, chief surgeons, judges, bankers, poets, and top engineers. They were the nation's brain, its management, its very soul. In the spring of 1940, these men were transported deep into the Katyn forest. Told they were stopping for a delousing shower, they were led to the edge of massive, pre-dug trenches. Soviet executioners stepped up behind them and pressed the cold steel of a German-made Walther pistol against the backs of their heads, specifically chosen so the forensic evidence would implicate the Nazis. They pulled the trigger 22,000 times and blew out the brains of an entire nation. The truth of Katyn was buried in the mud, denied by the Soviets for half a century. By every metric of warfare, Poland was a bankrupt, extinguished nation. Its land was partitioned, its gold was in exile, its brightest minds were massacred in a forest. But they had exported their gold, and they had exported their rage. Following the final orders of their command, the surviving Polish fighter pilots, those who had fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill in obsolete open cockpit planes, refused to surrender. They forced their bullet-riddled aircraft across the Romanian border, where they were interred in neutral detention camps. But the sympathetic Romanian guards had a habit of leaving gates unlocked and taking perfectly timed smoke breaks. The pilots vanished into the night. Armed with forged passports, they slipped aboard filthy, overloaded freighters crossing the submarine-infested waters of the Black and Mediterranean seas, eventually landing in Beirut or Alexandria before making their way to France. Emaciated and dressed in rags, they walked into Allied consulates and said the same thing: "I am a pilot. I am here to fight the Germans. Give me a plane." Nearly 8,000 Polish airmen made this hellish journey to France by early 1940. But the French military high command, drunk on its own arrogance, sneered at them. They believed the Poles had lost because of sheer incompetence. So they relegated these hardened combat veterans to training camps, forcing them to learn basic aviation theory all over again. By the time France abruptly collapsed under the tracks of the German Blitzkrieg, only a handful of Polish pilots had been allowed to fly, yet they still managed to shoot down over 100 German planes. Forced to run again, the Polish ghosts crossed the English Channel, arriving in a Britain that was suddenly standing alone on the edge of the abyss. The Royal Air Force was bleeding out, its pilot rosters decimated by the relentless onslaught of the Luftwaffe. Desperate, the British handed the keys of their cutting-edge Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires to the exiles. They formed No. 303 Polish Fighter Squadron, empowered by modern technology and fueled by a bottomless, burning hatred for the men who destroyed their homeland. These Polish ghosts became the deadliest killers in the sky. They logged the highest kill ratio of any squadron in the entire Battle of Britain. Inside occupied Poland, the Home Army built the largest, most lethal underground resistance network in Europe, running secret courts, publishing underground newspapers, and assassinating SS officers in broad daylight. Poland's 1939 campaign was a strategic tragedy. It relied on gentlemen's agreements in an era of gangsters. It bet on allies who abandoned it. It built a brilliant future, only to run out of time to finish it. As the winter of 1939 set in, the smart men in London and Paris felt completely secure. The French generals drank Bordeaux behind the concrete walls of the Maginot Line, mocking the primitive Poles. The British assumed the war would stagnate, that Hitler would turn east and fight the Soviets. They didn't see it coming. By crushing Poland, Hitler had seized all the coal, steel, and forced labor his war machine needed. More importantly, he had live-tested his ultimate weapon, the Blitzkrieg. Everyone thought the Maginot Line was unbreakable. Everyone thought France had the strongest army on earth. But in just 6 weeks, Hitler would turn all of that on its head. The same Blitzkrieg that crushed Poland would bring the Western powers to their knees. History Uncovered. Subscribe to Solid Tales.